Hello, y'all. So, my name is Mariana, and I am super excited to be one of your facilitators this summer for your fellowship experience, and also really excited to introduce you guys to one of your first Latinx Ed asynchronous lessons, which we're calling La Cultura Cura. And the goal of this is to increase confidence in your leadership and also your cultural strengths. So, to start us off, I want to begin by defining what does La Cultura Cura actually mean. So, we pulled this from the National Compadre Network, and they defined it as La Cultura Cura is a transformative health and healing philosophy that recognizes that within an individual's families and communities, authentic cultural values, traditions, and indigenous practices exist the pathway to healthy development, restoration, and lifelong well-being. So we're talking about cultural healing and again, how we have our ancestors and maintain this throughout time. And so the art, also a quick shout out, is by Gabriela Aleman. So using this philosophy, we can acknowledge how culture and lived experience should be brought into ourselves in leadership, even when we're usually taught to abandon those in order to be good leaders. And so I have this quote just kind of to summarize this up, which is our lived experiences shape our identities, and it's important to recognize these as our strengths and not as weaknesses. And so, again, I think we can all think of instances in our life where our community or even our own lived experiences has been viewed as missing or lacking something instead of focusing on all the good. This is because they're usually compared again to our dominant culture. And so to give language to this experience, we are going to use the terms asset-based thinking and deficit-based thinking. So asset-based approach focuses on strengths. It views diversity in thought, culture, and traits as positive assets. And so again, with this point of view and this lens, we can view things as like what's abundant, what's going right. And that's kind of like the focus of this perspective. Whereas with deficit-based thinking, it centers false notions of the absence of knowledge and assets in individuals, families, or even cultures rather than within systems. And so again, this is focused on shortcomings, what is lacking, what is going wrong, instead of focusing on what is the community already have and how can we use that to, improve things. And again, just to emphasize it a little more, by using deficit-based thinking and placing the blame on like the communities, we're ignoring the system failures that are happening in our country. And so when we reclaim our authentic roots and focus on our assets, we can find healing in that. So recognizing these thinking patterns is also so important because we can see them throughout history. And it is because of deficit-based thinking and the fact that it's reinforced that we can see or experience things like assimilation and imposter syndrome. And so to define these, I'm sure many of you are familiar, but as a quick refresher, so assimilation is when people adopt their customs, language, and habits of another culture, usually the dominant one in the society. So this can often lead to them losing their original cultural identity over time. And imposter syndrome is the inability to believe that one's success is deserved or has been legitimately achieved due to one's efforts or skills. Despite their accomplishments, they often worry about being exposed as a fraud. And so ultimately, these two thinking patterns that we see throughout history that affect our communities very deeply happen because we're seeing ourselves through a deficit perspective. We've been taught that in order to fit into the dominant culture, you're losing parts of yourself that you can only make up by, again, conforming, or believing that you are a fraud, which obviously is not the case. And so we are trying to shift these mindsets into asset-based. So to kind of connect it to our own lives, I want us to think about what is one example of how asset-based or deficit-based thinking has shown up in your own educational or leadership journey. And so you guys should have gotten a link to the Padlet, and I'll go ahead and show you guys here. You're only filling out this first column for now, and then the rest you'll fill out as you go through the lesson plan. So again, just on this first column, I want you to think about an instance where this has happened. And you can be broad in this, but I really, really want to invite you guys to take this as an opportunity to share part of your own story, as detailed as you want, but see how others can relate to stories that you've had. So I'll use my own example. When I would travel to Mexico, to visit relatives, mostly during like winter break. And then we would come back to the school. This was mainly during like middle school, elementary school, but honestly, I feel like it was a consistent thing throughout all of my educational journey. I would come back from a trip to Mexico to visit relatives. And I remember that first week back to school, people always asked where I went, and it was always dismissed. Like it felt like it didn't even count as a real trip, to the point where I started thinking it didn't count as a real trip, compared to kids that would travel to places like Europe or in Europe. And they would get a lot of attention. They would get asked a bunch about the culture there. And even the teachers, I remember, would ask these kids that would go to European countries to stand up in front of the class and tell them what they learned and share more about their trip, exploring this new culture and place. And so I always thought, now in hindsight, that I have the language to use this, to apply to this experience. That was definitely deficit-based thinking that was being used by my teachers in school at the time. Because obviously going to any other country is a very culturally enriching experience. So that is my example. You can use one that's specific again, or you can use one that's a little bit more broad, but we want to ask you to dig a little deep. And if you need a bit more time, feel free to pause this recording and then you can come back to it once you finish filling out that Padlet response. So, with all that being said, we now want to introduce you guys to the community cultural wealth model. And so to understand our community's wealth through an asset-based lens, we are going to use this model. And this model reframes and challenges assumptions that are made through deficit thinking, and it highlights several forms of cultural capital. And when we say cultural capital, we mean cultural abundance, richness, not necessarily monetary wealth, but a wealth of experiences, knowledge, ability, history, etc. So this model shifts the lens away from looking at communities of color from a deficit-based perspective. So that would be things like looking at the culture of poverty or disadvantages, etc., to an asset-based framework. And so these first six were adapted by Dr. Yoso. And then the last one, Migration Capital, is actually a recent addition by Dr. Rosa Jimenez. And so I'm going to walk you guys through each of them a little bit, and then we'll have another reflection activity for you guys to fill out. So with aspirational capital, Yoso defines this as the ability to maintain hopes and dreams for the future, even in the face of barriers. And for familial capital, she defines it as the cultural knowledges nurtured among familia that carry a sense of community, history, memory, and cultural intuition. For social capital, it's the networks of people and community resources. And kind of like we have in our own kind of definition on the slides, this can also mean like sharing emotional support and guidance. So like peer mentorship and things like that. For linguistic capital, it's the intellectual and social skills learned through communication experiences in more than one language and or style. So that's also pretty important because I think that's something a lot of us can share. So like Spanglish, bilingualism, things like that. Then navigational capital are the skills of maneuvering through social institutions such as schools, the job market, healthcare, and judicial systems. And so again, this has a lot of resilience in it because obviously these institutions were not built for people like us in mind, which is a perfect segue to resistant capital, which is the knowledge and skills cultivated through behavior that challenges inequality. So whatever behavior you do that's aimed to disrupt these systems, like advocacy, social justice, things like that, would fit into resistant capital. And then lastly, we have migration capital, which is the most recent addition to this model. And that is the knowledges, sensibilities, and skills cultivated through the array of migration/immigration experiences to the United States or its borderlands. And so again, it's just like, what are all these strengths that we're cultivating and that we gain by moving to the United States? I think this one to me is specifically important because migration is often what is really viewed through a deficit perspective. So again, like immigrants being seen as like having a lower socioeconomic status or not as much access to education, or traditional education. And so that is huge deficit-based perspective and thinking being imposed on our immigrant community. And so I love this one specifically because it's able to kind of, again, take back that narrative and own it as like, well, actually, we actually do gain a lot from migrating. And even though it's a hard experience, we come through with a lot of strengths from it. So, all forms of capital can be used to help people realize their own strengths and power. But I think it's important that while all of these things can be applied to our current culture and the culture of our parents and grandparents and just what's been built for us, it's important to also look ahead and think about how can we use this model to build a better tomorrow. And so that is where the Cultura, Cura y Evoluciona is a really, really important thing that we want you guys to think about here at Latinx Side. And so, again, the community cultural wealth model is a way we can counter the deficit-based thinking. So, by applying this model to our lives, we can evolve our culture to move beyond things like assimilation and imposter syndrome, which again are things we still see a lot today. And so, most importantly, though, we cannot forget that while a large part of cultural healing is holding on to or honoring the past, the future is equally as important. So, the existing culture can heal us, but we can also heal it by adapting our traditions, cultures, and values to best meet the needs of our community in our ever-changing world. And so I like to think of this as culture is a garden and it has deep, deep roots, which are obviously very important for life, but new blooms happen every season. And so I think it's a really good way of looking at it because, again, we can ground ourselves in the past, but also we can't forget to look at the present and the new things that are happening and the new context that we're existing in. What feels like every single day changes. We must also have a culture that's able to adapt to these things. So, to explore this community cultural wealth model, I want you guys to go back to the Padlet and you're only have to answer one of these prompts out of the four. Um, and so again, I'll just show you guys really quickly what that looks like on the Padlet. So it's going to be these next four, and you're just only picking one of these to answer. And I'll go ahead and go through those questions, but feel free to start filling them out. Again, pause if you need to. But for aspirational and familial capitals, we have what are your dreams and aspirations? How has your family or upbringing changed them? And how have these aspirations grown or shifted over time? Then for social and navigational capitals, we have how has your community or network helped you navigate systems and barriers? Or how have you helped your community navigate systems and barriers? So you only have to do one of those two questions for social and navigational. And then for linguistic and resistant capitals, we have what are your linguistic roots? How can language serve as a tool for empowerment, connection, or resistance? Then lastly, for migration capital, we have what is your or your family's immigration story? How has that journey shaped your leadership values or vision for the future? So again, all these things ultimately will be connected to leadership. And so super excited to see everyone's reflection on these. Also, feel free to interact with other people's as well. See how your stories differ, how they might be similar. Um, Again, I think that's a really important part of building this community. Again, pause if you need to, but I'm going to go ahead and move on to our closing reflection. So all the forms of capital we mentioned are all interrelated and have unique relationships with one another. And so if you need to go back again to the slides with the community cultural wealth model, you can go back to those. But the closing reflection that we really want you guys to take away from this is which capital feels most present in your leadership today? And which one do you feel called to strengthen or explore more deeply? So again, which capital, again, is do you feel like you usually interact with or use? And then which one do you want to explore more deeply? Or which one do you feel like you need to strengthen? So that is our last one, and that'll be the last column on the Padlet. But yeah, this was such an awesome lesson plan, and I'm so excited for you guys to learn this and be able to, again, reflect, apply to your own lives. And yeah, I will see you guys at the retreat.